Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Julian Calderon wash processed Colombia from A Matter of Concrete. And there's the bag right there. And A Matter of Concrete, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Ahi, a different wash processed Colombian coffee. This coffee was part of the Coffee Vines April 2024 subscription box, so it felt like a great opportunity to review one of their full bags of coffee, and we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. This one was definitely interesting, as the Coffee Vine mentioned that all of the coffees featured in this subscription set were omni roasted, and this one right here was definitely a fair bit more developed than our previous experience with this coffee roaster, and it was noticeable right from the start. So they listed as being omni roasted, but you can definitely tell that there's a fair bit of development to this coffee specifically, as I would say that this one was interestingly pretty close to a medium, if maybe on the slightly lighter side of the medium in terms of that roast profile. Definitely one of the more developed coffees I've had from a Dutch-based coffee roaster. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and that was the first takeaway I had from this coffee, was the roastiness, but it was made up for by a strong red theme to the cup in terms of a fruity and floral aspect to it. There is a cleaner but slightly tart berry component with a very subtle peachiness and a candied attribute as well. So for the most part, it's left a decent first impression, though I was really kind of surprised by the profile of this coffee. Interestingly enough, when I opened this bag for the first time and just kind of took a look at the beans, I said, wow, this is definitely more developed than I might have expected for this coffee, but it was interesting nonetheless. We move on to day 24 as we opted for the Chemex, and it was really nice off brew once again with a candied theme to the cup, but it didn't necessarily cool off particularly well, as the smoky quality can be felt yet again. It's a pretty straightforward cup of coffee up to this point, as it seems to offer those two components in very noticeable, we'll just say measure, that being the roasty profile and then that very red floral and fruit forward cup. So we move on to day 27 as we opted for the April brewer, and there was more of the same. As of this moment, the cup's been pretty consistent as its best right off brew, before the cup does cool down into much more of the roasty qualities while it's all encompassing the red theme of the cup. I would describe it as being reminiscent of a more developed Kenyan coffee with bright red berry brightness in a candied sense, as well as a notable florality yet again. So all of those things pretty consistent up to this point, but we move on to day 30 as we opted for the V60 with the Coffee Vines recipe. And it was a very interesting recipe, as they opted for a 93 degree bloom and then an 88 degrees Celsius pour after that moment. And I felt that the cup was still hindered by the development, as it did feel best right off brew, yet again with some notable red fruit profiles, but outside of that it continued to skew heavily in terms of that smokiness. So oftentimes when I do go with slightly lower temperatures for a coffee, it seems to take away maybe some more of the positive aspects, and that seemed to be the case with this one, as it wasn't quite offering the same level of sweetness that I'd experienced from some of the earlier days. So it didn't seem like an ideal trade-off for me. And on day 33, we tried the Chemex with the Coffee Vines recipe, and once again, a lot of the same thing, as it was best right off brew before it cooled down into what I would say is a little bit more of that developed roasty quality yet again. Before that, candied florality, candied red fruit and floral aspects to it, and it still finishes that way as well. But this time it was much more dominated by that smoky quality, so this was actually my least favorite version of the coffee up to this point. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was very interesting, as this one had a little bit of a resurgence to this coffee and was by far the best experience out of any of the days of this coffee, as it almost reminded me of what I would describe as being an Albanese grapefruit gummy taste with plenty of the red components in the cup. A better defined raspberry, as the smokiness felt notably less present than on any of the other days, so I felt like this was a really nice brew of this coffee, and definitely the best version of it that I'd had, at least up to this point, and it would be by the end. We move on to day 39 as we opted for the Chemex one more time with our standard recipe, and it was pretty similar to some of the earlier days we had as it had that red focus right off brew before settling into a little bit more of that developed smoky quality to it with not quite as much sweetness or as much definition as the previous day. Then on day 42, we went back to our same recipe from day 36, our standard recipe, of course, with the V60, and noticed a slight bit of inconsistency as it wasn't anywhere near as good as we had experienced on that day. It was a little bit more reminiscent of some of the earlier days and some of the days where we didn't necessarily get the best results as it continued to offer more of that smokiness. Red aspects remain present yet again with a notable bit of brightness, but for the most part, this cup was just okay. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we will start with the finish, level 4. So this finish comes in a multitude of directions, and it's very much in line with the very straightforward experience that we had with this coffee. That, of course, being that red fruit profile, and then in addition to that, that smoky quality. But that was kind of the finish that we were experiencing the most of. It seemed to last a fair bit, especially as the cup did cool down. Maybe on some of the earlier days, you were experiencing a little bit more brightness, a little bit more of the, we'll say, red fruit profiles to it, almost Kenyan-like. But towards the end, I would say, especially after a cool down, it did skew a lot more in a more developed direction. Acidity level 4, that's a very interesting one because there was plenty of brightness to this one, and this is the Rosado variety, which I could have this wrong. I think it's just actually a pink bourbon. Regardless, it still had plenty of those brighter qualities to it, and I think that was the varietal at play on this one. So very interesting in that sense, and very Kenyan-like in that brighter aspect of this coffee. You actually probably could have blindfolded me and had me try a bunch of different, more developed Kenyan coffees with this one, and I would have had a little bit of difficulty picking out which one was the Colombian coffee. Florality, level 4. And this one right here, it had plenty of the red floral aspects to it. I think that they have something along the lines of rosewater. Makes a lot of sense. It was maybe slightly in the more, we'll just say herbal sense. So I could say skewing a little bit more in that hibiscus-like aspect for me. Nonetheless, I would say that it was still one of the more present and pronounced components within this one. Very red floral forward coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. And then they have the raspberry listed on here, and I could see that. It doesn't necessarily give off the same sort of strong tartness that a lot of the Kenyan coffees do, which are oftentimes a little bit more reminiscent of red currants. But nonetheless, it had a fair bit of that tartness and maybe a slight bit of sweetness as well at times, so I think that could go a little bit more in the direction of the raspberry. Nonetheless, plenty of red berries within this one, definitely one of the more pronounced characteristics on this coffee. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We will start with the sweetness level 3. And I would say at its very best on that day where I had mentioned just how much sweetness there was in this coffee, maybe I could have bumped it up to the lower side of level 4, but for the most part, I would say that this coffee never necessarily reached a lot of the higher, sweeter aspects that I've experienced from either their other coffee or coffees of similar, we'll just say, just similar coffees in general. So this one right here, level 3, seems like the best place to put it. We move on to the citrus fruit level 3, and I did mention at one point there was a slight grapefruit-like quality to this one, and I could definitely see that as there were just, I would say, pink bourbon, even Kenyan-like characteristics, including that slight citric quality to them. So level 3 felt like the best place for that. We move on to the savoriness level 3, and I had mentioned also that there was a little bit more of that kind of herbal floral aspect to this one, and that's where that does come into play as it scored that level 3 mark. Body level 3. Definitely a fair bit of texture within this coffee, and as I was drinking it, I said, that's one of the better aspects of this coffee, and maybe something I haven't highlighted and pointed out too much within this one. And then the two level 3s that are most worth discussing, and I saved both of them for last, we'll discuss them together. The cleanliness and the smokiness, both scoring at that level 3. And I've said before that if a wash processed coffee isn't going to score at a level 4, that's most likely because it's going to be marred by some sort of smoky quality, and that was the issue with this coffee, as I felt like maybe 3 was going to be very high, especially given that my experience with the other coffee I've had from this coffee roaster was definitely much lighter than this experience. So by no means did I go into this one expecting it to come out the way that it did, which was very surprising for this coffee, but it's something that I think really played a huge role within this coffee, and it's why it's something something that needed to be discussed and highlighted within this tasting wheel, as level 3 is very high, especially for a European coffee roaster. I can't think of many non-British coffee roasters that have scored this high in terms of that smokier quality, but it was present, and no matter what I did, it seemed to be one of the more present aspects within this coffee. So that's why that scored as a level 3, and I feel like it was going to kind of impact the overall clarity and cleanliness of this coffee, as it did have a very nice red theme and profile to it, but it was definitely marred by much more of the developed and smoky qualities. So both those things felt like best discussed together. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Obviously, it's skewed in the direction of a profile that isn't necessarily in line with my own preferences, and I'm not entirely sure what happened. I'm not entirely sure if the Omni Roast just goes that far along in the development, but the other coffees that we're going to be discussing from that subscription set were also Omni Roasted, but I didn't feel like they offered that same sort of profile to them. And I guess that's just kind of interesting, because I wonder if maybe there was a filter roasted version of this coffee. And if I have this correct, I do believe that Matter of Concrete's version on their website is a filter roast version of this coffee. If that might have been different, or how that might have been better, because on paper going into this, I had some very high expectations for this coffee, given the first impression I'd had of this coffee roaster was pretty positive. This one right here sounded very much like a type of coffee that I would have enjoyed as well. So I think having that profile just kind of taken away from the direction I was hoping for it going towards, that was going to impact this coffee in general. So safe to say, not necessarily my favorite, and it's very easy to see why. Just a little bit more development than I might have liked from a coffee like this. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's actually a very easy recommendation suggestion, and that's for anybody that does like their slightly more developed Kenyan coffees, because as I mentioned, this offered an abundance of those Kenyan profiles to it. So plenty of those red components to it in terms of a floral and fruity scents, as well as plenty of brightness and plenty of body as well. So combine all of those things with a little bit more of that development to it, then I feel like that's the best direction to point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way to leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Julian Calderon wash process Colombia from A Matter of Concrete. Thank you for watching.